All right. You want me to get the ball rolling, Ace, or do you want to set the subject and tenor? What would you prefer?
Yeah, man, go for it.
All right. Thinking today we'd cover a bit at your behest. What exactly constitutes? I mean, we've got an ongoing discussion as to what exactly constitutes post-war, post-1945 American conservatism. If in fact such a tendency in itself exists, or if it's just merely kind of an oppositional talking point subculture. But first and foremost, you said you wanted to take up Huey Long and kind of what his candidacy represented, both in and of itself, as a populist tendency, but also, as you know, owing to your research, Huey Long, not only was he a real challenge to Roosevelt, Huey Long was actually, he really kind of set the tenor for George Wallace, as a man who really stood to split the vote and insinuate himself as a kingmaker into a national election. I don't believe that happened before long, owing to the electoral map. It certainly didn't in the post-Civil War years. I mean, you might be able to dig out some old Whig candidate, from literally one of the first half dozen presidential elections and find some situation that's comparable. But in the era of universal suffrage and the Civil War amendments, I really don't think you will find precedent. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Huey Long, I believe there was a poll in 1930. And obviously there wasn't an abundance of national polling services then, it wasn't an industry into itself, but there still was reasonable methodology by which one could get a basic sense of at least whether a candidate was competitive or not at the national level. Okay. Obviously that was manipulated then as it is now. I mean, we talked about that. I mean, not you and I, but we generally, people on the right, talked about that a year ago at this time, for reasons that don't need to be elaborately enumerated. But I believe in 1930 it was speculated that on the low end Long could probably get 10 million votes and as a third party candidate, meaning basically Roosevelt was done. Okay. Conspiracy theorists, obviously they've got their pet theories that this is why an assassin killed Long. I have nothing to comment on that. I mean, who knows? I'd have to research the issue more. However, what's most interesting about Long is that even to this day, he's kind of maligned as this crazy sort of either proto-fascist by the left or people on the right. They tend to they act like he was some kind of nutty like Bernie Sanders type. He wasn't at all. And a lot of what he proposed, the Share Our Wealth program, that was his competitor program to the New Deal. It actually contained a lot of stuff we take for granted. He wanted old age pensions for people over 65. He wanted World War I veterans were afforded this bizarre compensation structure where basically they were issued these bonds that matured in 1945. It's ironic, isn't it, that year was kind of pulled out of the air, considering its significance in history. But Long wanted to he wanted to he wanted to issue a lump sum to World War I veterans in lieu of this kind of graduated pseudo pension structure by which basically they had to, they have to wait a decade and a half for anything. He wanted targeted federal spending in the Dust Bowl in areas most hit by the natural disasters that most affected agriculture. This is not crazy Karl Marx left-wing stuff or demand-side Keynesianism. Schumpeter at the time and Murray Rothbard, not at the time but later, they both identified the Great Depression basically as a deflationary spiral and a cash drought. And Schumpeter was about as conservative fiscally as you can imagine an economist. Even he was saying, look, it might require literally a $1 billion infusion of very targeted spending into the American economy in order to jumpstart things at the height of the Depression. So I mean, my point is that Long was not some guy. He wasn't some crazy labor leader who, owing to the crisis of unemployment and poverty, like just somehow got catapulted to national prominence. And I'll say this too. Not only was the share our wealth movement, not only was it not particularly radical by our standards, but the New Deal, in contrast, didn't really accomplish anything other than putting people to work on superfluous projects. Like literally down the street from me, there's like the Skokie Lagoons. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's cool. It's this whole like nature preserve. There's all these man-made lakes. There's all these trees that aren't indigenous to Illinois. But you know why that's there? It's because like Roosevelt, it's basically just like what he put unemployed people doing. He basically created what the New Deal did, and what got people to the polls to vote for him over and over again is that he was basically like paying people in what amounted to scrip, like federally subsidized scrip, to work on projects that had like no actual function. They weren't improving infrastructure. They weren't targeted to bail out key industries. They weren't really giving relief to veterans. There wasn't a permanent pension structure put in place for the elderly. I mean, that came later, but the administration was set up. But I mean, people weren't getting real relief, because obviously the economy would have to have momentum for that money they were getting to be worth anything. But so yeah, I mean these are some of the important things to consider about Long, and I think there's a natural prejudice against him because he's a Louisiana native, and except for maybe like my county of residence, like the entire state of Louisiana has like the worst reputation in the union for public corruption and just kind of overall nuttiness. I mean, maybe Florida's like eclipsing it now, but no, Long was very much an outsized figure, and I believe he. I mean, granted, people didn't live as long then, and there was just a younger culture in Washington. But even so, I think Long was in his early 30s when he first got to the Senate, and that was pretty unheard of. Like even then, I mean, the dude was something of a prodigy, in terms of his aptitude for political campaigning, and particularly the then new technology, of radio. Apparently, he used that to really great effect. But yeah, I mean that's about the extent of my knowledge on Long. But he definitely, I mean, like Wallace, he definitely does not get a fair treatment in history. I know there's a film about him some years back that didn't even like really make a dent with Sean Penn. And it wasn't even because it was just I can't remember. One of the critics, I think, it might have been in the Atlantic, which is basically, I think in the Atlantic is something you read when you have nothing better to read at like the airport lounge, the train station. But they do, one of their movie critics, this was like years back now, but occasionally he had a worthwhile take, and like his view of the Huey Long movie is not so much that like nobody likes Sean Penn or that the film wasn't compelling. He's like, I don't even think Huey Long like registers any longer on like people's historical memory. And I mean, he's probably right. And this was, I think, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. Now it's probably even more pronounced. But I mean, I don't know. What's your take on Long? I don't want to suck all the air out of the room, man.
Yeah, well, we don't hear a lot about people who try to use all of the political spectrum for everyone else's benefit. And I think that's why Huey Long and Teddy Roosevelt also, as candidates, their platforms are really important when we're talking about 20th century American populism. And I remember reading about Long for the first time, and it was like, oh wow, you could really do a lot within politics to compete with someone as we know who has been so romanticized as FDR. Someone like that can be competed politically, and I know on our side of Twitter we see a lot of people, even a lot of normies, who are finding out about Huey Long, and that just speaks to how palatable the platform is.
Well, yeah, it's a correction too. I mean, like to your point, these things that we take for granted, like veterans pensions, old age pensions, even Long's tax scheme, people, the cap on personal fortunes, adjusting for inflation, it came out to something like $3 billion. It was like $2 or $3 billion. So I mean, like it wasn't like Long was acting like, oh, if you got, personal assets of over like $100,000, we're going to tax the shit out of your estate. Like, he was not talking about the death tax as, like Grover Norquist types kind of, it might sound tasteless, but that was kind of like a correct description of what it was being bandied about in the 80s. And when you consider the Depression, I mean, it really was, Long's tax scheme, considering the circumstances, actually was fair. He was not it was not reckless, and it wasn't even, the number of people. I mean, being a billionaire now was not particularly common. Somebody with a personal wealth fortune of like $2 billion. You're talking about literally like a handful of men in the country. Like that's it. We're not talking about a robust class of people. And we're not even talking about like Mitt Romney types. Like, we're literally talking about like the 1% of the 1%. Because I know that's what a lot of his critics on the right, historian types are like, yeah, and what the key to share of wealth was the death tax. They wanted to, steal your money when you died. It's like, that's nonsense. But it's also Long too. He was he was an America firster. Not just in name. He came out and he said, one of the reasons he was so popular with veterans, it wasn't just because, he stood up for them and kind of made, and he really made an issue of what happened with the bonus army and how those men were treated. But he said, as, the New Dealers were banging the war drums, he's like, Standard Oil and Wall Street, like, got us into one European war. Like, are we, you want to start through a second one with even more catastrophic, human cost. And that was not the kind of thing that, I'm sorry, I just got to get some juice here. There we go. And this was not, Lindbergh could, Charles Lindbergh, Lindbergh could get a good crowd out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or even in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or even in Downton, Illinois. But I mean, Long, like I mentioned a minute ago, I mean, Long was a guy who could pull Long was a guy who could potentially pull, 10 million votes. Like, him saying this kind of stuff, I mean, that was not something the New Dealers wanted to be allowed to continue. That's an interesting question. Like, had Long, like I said, I haven't researched the issue enough to drop an informed take on whether Long was murdered for political reasons or not. But I will say this: like, had he lived, he would have been silenced like Lindbergh was, if not actually like indicted on some trumped up like financial tax evasion charge or something, which the New Dealers were not above availing their enemies to. I guarantee, had he survived, like, Long would have been sabotaged in some way. He would not have been allowed to simply just carry on with playing foil to Mr. Roosevelt, who was very, very much intended from day one to be president for life. And I mean, that's the issue too, is that you really have to look at the New Deal as a revolution, and that's Tom Fleming. I'm always citing him. He was an Irish Catholic from Boston. He wasn't some guy like me, and nor was he some like lost cause historian who loves the Confederacy. He was basically a center left kind of guy, which gives him some credibility in discussing Roosevelt, because even he admits, in the opening pages, he's like, you know what? He's like, when I was a little kid, because he was born like in the 30s. He's like, my parents had a photo. They had a painting of that Virgin Mary above the fireplace next to a photo of President Franklin Roosevelt. He's like, I grew up thinking Roosevelt was like a saint, and he wore like St. Paul or something. He's like, as I studied the man, he's like, it becomes clear that the New Deal was not only revolution, they intended Roosevelt to be president for life. Until Roosevelt died, he was going to remain the president. And the New Deal was going to socially engineer every aspect of American life. Just as much as the National Socialist German Reich was, just as much as the Soviet Union was, this was just the epoch, okay? That cannot be denied. and Long was also Long. I can't remember the exact quote, but Long is one of his big kind of talking points was that share our wealth was that we're going to share our wealth while keeping America American. We're not going to basically what we were saying was that like a New Deal is about social engineering. It's not about actually relief for the poor or helping people adjust to these radically altered circumstances so that they can make a living amidst these new technologies. And the long view, the long Huey Long take was this has everything to do with social engineering and virtually nothing to do with like actual poverty relief. And he was right. I mean, I think that's inarguable. But yeah, what do you think about all of that?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I'd like to make the connection between Huey Long and Murray Rothbard. And even though, well, I mean, Rothbard kind of speaks to some of the gatekeeping in the 60s with the paleo libertarians and paleo cons. But in the 90s, when that was happening again, I believe Rothbard, I think it was in 1992. I saw this on Lou Rockwell. I think that's the website from last night. But anyways, he mentioned his right-wing populism platform. And he makes it very clear, this is something that can win and compete in two-party elections. And it's very similar to a Huey Long type candidacy. So things like that all the way in the 90s. I know you said some of the Long positions kind of went out of style as the years went on. But just like today, when you see on Twitter, some of these, populist wings of Twitter are really starting to see the relevancy of some of those points from a long time ago.
Well, what's interesting, yeah, it's interesting you raise that. One of the guys whose takes I really like consistently on Twitter. I wish he'd get active on other platforms, but Nightmare Visions, like that was like a horrifying handle, but he's actually like a good-natured guy, and he's appeared a lot on Babcast, and he's always making the point that libertarianism these days is basically like it's basically like a con. Like basically they're on the political equivalent of what some of these like TV preachers always begging for money are up on. It's like this going nowhere kind of like non-ideology that basically presents itself as some kind of competitor to the mainstream GOP, but it really is about just guys selling books and it's a handful of gadflies railing against fiat currency, as well as some more like thoughtful types. But even the more thoughtful types of what they propose will like never like translate in policy terms. However, to your point, in the early '90s, that globalism was really shaking things up. The combination of the end of the Cold War, the integration of the East Bloc, in complex interdependence terms, and like the global economy, as well as NAFTA, which was hugely controversial. That was like the true like deindustrialization of America. Like Ross Perot, yeah, I mean it speaks as though Ross Perot polled 19%. I mean that's crazy, but that was really Rothbard's resurgence. And yeah, Rothbard, that's when Rothbard really got kind of like a second wind, as it were. And he died relatively young. He was only in his 60s, and like he dropped dead. I mean, he was a notoriously unhealthy guy, I guess. Like chain smoker, kind of like a perpetually nervous, like Jewish guy who smoked like 3 packs a day. That's not like a recipe for old age, but no, he was a brilliant guy, and he in predictive terms, pretty much everything he said about NAFTA came true. What he said about the devaluation of the dollar like hasn't so much come true, but he was I don't think he was his predictive takes on monetary stuff were never great, but his book on the Great Depression, I think is probably about the best history you can read of it. And yeah, I mean, he was a guy who he associated himself with the Reform Party, like not officially, like you never saw like a position with them, but he and Pat Choate, who's another guy. Choate was a very different kind of economist than Choate is very much a Frederick List, Hamiltonian type, very different than Rothbard. But in political terms, they very much agreed. And one of the things the early Reform Party attracted, they attracted a lot of very, very heterodox economists who had some very who had some very ballsy ideas, frankly. And yeah, if there was a time when, I mean, if there's that's what's strange about the ascendancy of Trump, frankly. I mean, I don't think it's very, I don't think it's weird that a man like Trump, who like represented what he did to people, was elected. But I would have thought that, like all things being equal, like let's say like I lived 40 years ago, like and I was the same age I am now. Um, I would have thought that, yeah, like if a man like Trump and the entire kind of the entire kind of like deep state revolt against him, if that was going to ensue, I would have thought it would be around like 92, like 96. Um, but I guess Clinton kind of won that 92 election by accident of fate, and then he very effectively he very effectively shut down any real opposition. I mean, people. I don't want to go too far afield or to go too scattered on tangents, but I was making the point because I lived through it like as an adult. Um, the war on terror started with Bill Clinton, and those were frightening times, man. Like people think they got it bad with the police and stuff these days and censorship. It it's not nearly as bad as it was, man. Like in the Clinton '90s, it really wasn't. And Clinton really did a lot, like to defang his, not just to defang his opposition, but to really just kind of like eradicate it. There was like no opposition to Clinton. It was just clear that like Clinton was going to serve 2 terms. It like Bob Dole like was I mean Bob Dole basically pulled like a Biden, with the exception obviously he wasn't like artificially installed as president, but like Dole like didn't even actually campaign. Like the dude obviously wanted like no part of in '96. I mean, he seemed to like want actually no part of like what was going on. Like half the time he seemed like he wasn't even awake. It's like, this is a charade. It's like if we just like installed like Bill Clinton as like president for 8 years, like just say that. Don't pretend that this is some kind of contested affair. But it I yeah, I think there's something to other than nostalgia to like cyclical history, not just in terms of people's aesthetic psychology and what they reminisce about, like socially, like there is something to like political currents kind of going like 30-year increments and like repeating, and like yeah, that's why people drew all these comparisons between Buchanan and in the early '90s and Trump and Ross Perot and Trump. Like there is something like today is something like the early '90s, like in more than superficial ways, if that makes any sense. I don't think I'm just going prematurely senile, and even if I am, I still think I'm right about that take. Um, I think that dovetails with your point, unless I'm misreading you entirely.
No, I think you're all good. And speaking of the 90s, I'm pretty sure we're going to have an episode coming soon talking about the 90s decadence and some of the culture wars. Obviously, Buchanan's very relevant in that. But just to connect it back to Rothbard, especially during this time where he's laying out right-wing populism and how candidates can run with that very easily and can win with it. I think it's also kind of shoehorning in another important figure, Russell Kirk. He is, because one of the things that Rothbard lays out in that populism mission statement is he says, look, libertarians, I know we're supposed to be the small government, low taxes people, but we do have to get in the government. And so we should kind of fall in line with the conservatives of the era, more specifically the paleo conservatives who were rising in the early 90s. And so he was kind of reverting back to a pre-National Review conservatism, which I would say is Russell Kirk, and specifically his book, The Conservative Mind, which really shows you like what is real conservatism in America, connecting it with Burke. But I'd like you to go on about some of the 50s conservatism that was existing during the infrastructure when there was hardly any for the conservative movement.
Kirk's an interesting guy. Kirk, Walker Percy, Shelby Foote. Foote's a little bit different because people don't know this, but I mean, you probably do it because you're a learned guy, but Shelby Foote actually was Jewish. He was a Sephardic Jew, and in the South, the earliest Jewish settlements in America were Sephardic Jews in the South, and they were very Confederate. Okay, and J.P. Benjamin, Confederate Minister of the Treasury was of the same stock. But in any event, that was just a tangent. But Russell Kirk was very much a Southerner, but he was a Catholic convert. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to put shade on that. But so was Walker Percy. And there's this whole kind of milieu of 50s conservatives who, you know, owing to the culture of the Nuremberg system, which had literally outlawed the right, and owing to the kind of very Protestant roots of America First, and you know, people's association of right-wing Protestantism with nativism. I'm talking about the center Protestantism, not, you know, the Northeast type. You had guys who were really kind of seeking, you know, they wanted something that resounded in tradition like deeply, but that also was acceptable. And they weren't just, that wasn't just them being cowardly about it either. You know, I mean, yeah, there were some types like that who were just kind of, you know, looking to be politically correct. But I think a guy like Kirk, I think he actually thought this through. And it's fascinating because like Kirk wrote in it was either in the Conservative Mind or in his book on American foundations. He said that, like, if you want to understand America, I don't entirely accept this take, and I'll qualify that in a minute. He said that America is a convergence of Jerusalem, Rome, Athens, and London. Okay. Frankly, that's a very, very Catholic take. That's kind of like the Catholic, like, quasi-outsiders view, but not totally of America. Like what I'm getting at, and again, I'm not talking about shade on anybody, but that's very much like the view of a Catholic convert, like of the state of America in the 50s. And it's also like kind of like de Maistre. I think Kirk, if I'm not, it was either Buchanan or Kirk whom I came to Joseph de Maistre. And de Maistre is fascinating because de Maistre, in some ways, he's the consummate like Catholic thinker, you know, and he was like the first among like the counter-revolutionaries of 1789 in France. But Kirk, like de Maistre, he was always coming back to the fact of like, well, the inner witness and like the personal conscience, you know, that is, you know, that is God speaking to man, and like that has to dominate in government. And we, you know, we can never have a theocracy, no matter how bad things get, because you know that's a sin in its own right. That's not a very Catholic view. Okay, but then on the other hand, like I said, he was perpetually trying to find parallels between like the positive aspects of, you know, late Rome and Byzantium with like America. It's like, oh yeah, America's become an empire since the defeat of the German Reich, but we can be a benevolent empire if only, you know, if only we proceed with virtue. And of course, you know, that virtue is that of like a very Thomas nature. You know, it's very, very Catholic. Okay. Now don't get me wrong. It on the one hand, in the 1950s, Catholicism was still not particularly popular with like the American traditional right. But interestingly, to your point, the fact, you know, we talked about this before. It wasn't just the Wallace coalition, you know, like creating kind of like, you know, a white nationalist coalition by default. The post-Nuremberg right was really, it came off as like so kind of anti-Christian, so kind of like opposed to traditional morality, so kind of nakedly zealous in its interpretation of the Establishment Clause as banishing faith from like public space, period. That really did a lot to frankly like take the edge off a lot of sectarian hostility between Catholics and Protestants. Which is good. It's unfortunate that, you know, this was the context in which it occurred. But I don't think Kirk was disingenuous either. Like I said, I don't think he was simply shopping for some kind of faith, you know, in order to like make a right-wing case that was politically correct or commensurate with the values that have become predominant. But I don't think it's accidental that so many of these guys in the American right, you know, including but not exclusively those guys with Southern roots, just kind of sought out like, you know, Catholicism as converts. Now, mind you, too, in the 50s, to your point, you know, this was before Vatican II, which was 1964. So I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, like the church was gravely injured by the war, but you still had a very traditional Catholic church in the 1950s. You know, like that's something to keep in mind too. So like what these guys were converting to, it was very different than like a guy today or even a guy post 64. You know, like saying like I know I'm going to become Catholic and get back to kind of the true, get back to a true conservatism that's that is just naturally suited kind of to sound government. I mean, that's my read on it. Some people might think that's overly esoteric, but I mean, Kirk himself was like esoteric in some ways, man. Like he drops references from everybody from Sophocles to like Josephus to like Romans. I'm not good on Roman history at all, and like he constantly like drop like Roman historians I've never heard of. I mean, not that that means anything, but I'm pretty well read in like the American political tradition, and it's like I've never heard of these thinkers, man. Like I think it's a stretch to claim that like, well actually like Hamilton and Jay were relying on this this Roman like man of letters from 60 AD. It's like I think he was in some ways kind of a foil Leo Strauss, because Leo Strauss actually hated Russell Kirk. Like he really hated him, which is interesting because Strauss actually went to bat for guys like Mircea Eliade, who were like real fascists. So like I mean, there was some kind of personal like animosity between like Kirk and Strauss, like that. I mean, who knows like where that emerged from? But I think Kirk was kind of trying in some way to be like the Paleo Con like foiled at Strauss. I can't say for certain, but I am pretty confident in that take. I mean, that's all I got on Kirk. You probably got more knowledge of him than I, frankly, but it's been many years since I've read him.
Yeah, and we also know, I just saw on Twitter one of the writers from the American Conservative magazine, which of course was founded by Pat Buchanan. He mentions how when we're looking at things like the old right and the history with it, it's very clear that a lot of it is mostly made up around drama between writers. And so what you were saying about, Strauss and Russell Kirk, I mean, that doesn't, I can definitely believe that because I didn't know that, because that seems to be, whether it's National Review or, that's why I mentioned the infrastructure is so important, because it allows that debate to happen. And so you can understand the nuances like the ones you just listed out right there. So.
No, definitely. And it's always been, there was I'm trying to the Chronicles magazine. I don't know what they're like now, if they're still in print even, or if they even have an online presence. Like I honestly don't know, but
they're still active.
Okay. I used to pick them up. I mean, this was like 25 years ago. They used to run San Francis, and he was a controversial guy, and when he got dropped by everyone but I think the Washington Times was like the last kind of like mainstream paper that ran him. They used to run him in Chronicle, so I'd pick it up to read San Francis.
Well, you know who's responsible for that, right? There's a very specific writer who wrote about San Francis that led to the Washington Times firing, and that was Dinesh D'Souza, who is champion as the pop version of modern conservatism. So once again, more ancient rivalries, coming out into the open.
Really, there's nothing gooey about that. Like Babs was making that point. It's like, who the hell are all these crazy Hindu guys who just kind of like, they decide like, yeah, I'm like Joe Conservative. See, I sit in an office with lots of wood and I drink scotch. Like it's just like random and weird. Like everything else aside, like ethnicity and like roots in the country aside, it's like it's just like a weird thing. I don't know if it's like a caste-based culture, so they tend towards these kinds of contrived adaptations. But no, you're absolutely right. I'd forgotten that. Yeah, D'Souza's like, how dare you have this like, racist bastard, not only you publish him, but he was kind of like the like conservative at the Washington Times, which is not Washington Times even then. I mean, it was a hell of a lot more right than the Washington Post, but it was not exactly like a bash in like right wing thought. Right. No, you're absolutely right. But I used to pick it up to read San Francis. But other than Francis and Michelle Malkin, I mean, it was basically like a Catholic paper. I mean, which is fine. But conservatism owing to Kirk, they really were, it really was trying to like reinvent itself as like a Catholic tendency. Um, which on the one hand makes sense, but on the other hand, it's, I've made the point before, particularly in talking to guys or friends like E. Michael Jones. One of the ways to understand America, I mean, not just today, I mean, going back to its origins, other than other than the UK, I'd argue America is probably the most anti-Catholic country that's ever existed. Like it really is. You know what I mean? In ways both prosaic and profound. And the Establishment Clause essentially, like reading between the lines of the Establishment Clause, it's basically saying that like, you know, we're making sure that like even if like, you know, the Roman Church gets like a, you know, a little colony like established here, like they're never going to have a reach like beyond the borders of that state or that town. You know, I mean that's, and just everything about even even the high church types, you know, like Virginia planter types, you know, I mean, people like that seem strange. I find Episcopalians to be kind of strange. Okay, like again, I don't want shit on people, but because they seem to be, because they seem to borrow so heavily from like Catholic rite and ritual, but then like reject so much of doctrine. I mean, that's a whole other show. But point being, I don't even if America was even even notwithstanding the New Deal revolution, even talking about America of say like the World War I era or something, I I don't really see like how you could never truly assimilate like a truly Catholic like political party into American national life. Like you just couldn't do it. Um, is that going to change? I don't think so. Some people do, but I don't really think I just don't think it's possible. It's just not, you know. And people turn around and say like, you know, I myself was making the point that if you want to understand power in America, look at the demographics. Look at the demographics of the Supreme Court because that's the truly sovereign organ of government. Definitely post Watergate, it is, but it even before I believe it was. And you might notice there's a conspicuous absence of Protestants. Clarence Thomas is a Catholic, which is rare, an American black Catholic. But point being, okay, those Catholics on the Supreme Court, like, read Justice Roberts' opinions. Do those like read like some dyed-in-the-wool Catholic? Or does that read like, you know, some American guy who's like not entirely comfortable with how to reconcile his faith with like the fucked up American culture he's in? Okay, because to me, like every Catholic judge, it sounds a lot like the latter. You know what I mean? How else could it be? You know, like basically his job is like enforce as right, like what is like diametrically opposed to Catholic doctrine. I mean that you can't. My point is you can't be a real Catholic and serve U.S. governments, and it was that way even before you know the social revolutions that brought about you know this kind of reconfiguration of the way people think about you know race and sex and things of this nature. It's just America is just at its constitutional core, um, figuratively and literally, it is just anti-Catholic. I guess that was my point. Forgive the long-windedness, but yeah, that was definitely Russell Kirk's mission, and he's also an important thinker. I mean, just even taking aside, if you just want to read, I mean, if you just want to read an American scholar who's got a good understanding, like of why culture is important, how it interfaces with you know the posterity of a people like in linear like natal terms and like why humans find these things important and you know like why this is essential not just to you know the maintenance of preserving a consensus in day-to-day terms but also like you know giving people's individual lives meaning. I mean you should definitely read Russell Kirk, but that kind of stuff doesn't really translate to electoral politics. And I mean, it just doesn't, you know, and that's kind of the point I'm always trying to drive home. And yeah, on my platforms, is that I want people to break themselves of thinking that you know there's some sort of like electoral solution to these historical problems. Because that's what we're facing. We're facing historical problems, okay? Like what we're talking about here and what we talk about on my platforms, as in what you do on yours. Like our takes might be different, like us severally, like in this kind of broader community. But we're talking about problems of a historical and a theological nature. We're not talking about like voting problems, or we're not talking about like political problems, like the guys on the ground in Northern Ireland or in Beirut, like when things are bad there, they have political problems, okay? And unfortunately, those often turn into military problems in their cases. Like that's not what we are talking about. I think there may be that potential. Unfortunately, we're not there at this moment, and I'm thankful for that to God, quite literally. But people, people like Kirk, intelligent as they are, this is kind of a blind spot they have, I think. Um, because it seems to afflict people regardless of like intellect or caste. I hear like regular working guys kind of bandy about this, like at the bar, like proverbially and literally. And I hear guys who are, really high flying intellects, like talk like, oh gee, Trump wasn't the right man, but once we get the right man and once, people start thinking right, we're gonna have this great like white political culture. It's like that's none of things work, man. Like you can't. That's like saying that the Roman Empire could have like voted its way like out of like imploding on itself or something, or that like the Mandarin court, like when it came to say this degenerate kleptocracy where everybody was fucked up on opium all day. It's like if only they had like the right man like running for like I don't even know like what the post would be there, but you get my point. Like you can't the spiritual and historical crises and epochal events and occurrences. You can't you can't go to the polls about them and resolve them. All right, that's my sermon for the day. Like I didn't mean to go on that sort of a tangential rant, so forgive me.
Well, I think the key is infrastructure because during the 50s, you really had authors, you had books, and beyond that, you kind of had to be in the know. And so once you have like when National Review becomes established, then that becomes the norm. Well, it would have been nice if Russell Kirk had a similar. I think he contributed actually to National Review, but yeah. So well, regardless of that, if the foundation was more Kirkian rather than Buckley, that just kind of speaks to like what is possible, and especially today when you see some of the populism that people are seeing as palatable. And I think the more people learn about, literally learning from history, because I think that's what it's all about when talking about the old right, showing the difference between, what you were saying about the Nixon coalition and the Reagan coalition. They're very, the left acts like it's one big thing of like the 80s was one long victory for conservatism. But we know that like the Nixon coalition was very different. And, we know that Reagan ushered in libertarians and we're very aware of the consequences of that. So I think that speaks to all those differences are important.
No, and it's also, I mean, too, is that even it's just that certain topics are off limits. I'm not I'm not even saying like, oh, if you want to have a proper understanding of history, you have to be some sort of like relatively hardline revisionist like I am. But what I mean is that like even smart people, even smart guys and smart ladies who even if they realize like going to public school is like bullshit, I got the internet, like I can I can access the materials I need to get a clear picture, of the guiding philosophies of my own culture and others and history and things. There's like taboos are a very real thing. Whether they're social, whether they're sexual, whether they're political, theological, and the political and the theological tend to run together. There's certain Rubicons people don't seem to be willing to cross. I mean, it sounds hokey, but that really is like half the battle, and that's one of the reasons why like I try and go face to face with people a lot, like quite literally. I mean, maybe I'm a bad example. I'm kind of a weird person, but what I'm trying to convey is like, look, man, like I do like normal person stuff. Like I'm not like a creep. I'm not some guy in a bunker. Like I'm not some dude who did like hard time with like face tattoos or like a fucking mental patient. Like and there's nothing, there's nothing like wrong with like questioning like the court narrative of the New Deal and the court narrative of Nuremberg. And I found that that's like the big kind of hurdle. And it's also too even people like I found people who are actually deeply religious, but like they're afraid to admit that until they know you really well. They think you'll make fun of them, or they think that like you'll think they're a nut, or they've just been so conditioned like, oh gee, it makes people uncomfortable to raise these topics. Like there's people like I actively like pray with now, and like when I first met them, they like pretended like they had no actual beliefs in that regard because they're like, it's just not, it's like, it's just not appropriate. Appropriate. That's like their word. Like it's not appropriate to like raise these things, or it's not, it's not appropriate to think about race critically. I'm not even talking about it in like negative terms. I mean, just like think about it critically. Where it's like, no, it's not like appropriate to like be like, really what really happened in the Second World War, and like why these tensions come about, and like why what happened at the foot of the cross to make the people who refuse to accept Christ and the people who became Christians, like how come 1,000 years later like Jews are so much at odds with us? Like why is that? Like I said, it's not even about accepting like my take or anybody else's perspective. It's just like a taboo. Like you're not supposed to explore these things, and that's a big part of like my notion is once smart people I'm talking people like smarter than I am. I don't mean like people like me. I mean once like truly smart people overcome these kinds of self-limiting um psychic barriers, the problem will kind of take care of itself, because then they'll realize like, well, we got real crises in this country of a social nature, um some of which are prosaic stuff, just like, well, why do we live under a government that's like taxing us to death, that's like designed to fight the Cold War and not really do anything else? Like 30 years on, like why do we still have it? And like profound things, like why is morality, both public morals as well as kind of the intimate personal morality, why is this stuff always under assault? Like why can't you talk about race? Once truly intelligent people begin posing these questions, um, things are going to change dramatically, and I believe they already are. I mean, that's one of the reasons why. That's one of the reasons why big tech is so fucking paranoid. There are a lot. I'll tell you this much, man. Like there's far less ability to censor people today than there was 30 years ago, but there's far more paranoia about it. And it's not just because like, like the older generation dying off. Like it's not even entirely conscious, but people discern that like mainstream sources of data really have no credibility anymore. Like I made the point, I think on Babcast, and I've been thinking about this a lot. Like one of the reasons why like media like is always they fail at it, but like mainstream media is constantly trying to like make these like self-aware jokes, because that's the only thing they can think of to try and stay relevant, because they know that everybody knows they're liars. Like they know that nobody takes what they say seriously. And I'm telling you, man, I'm a little bit surrendered at the tail end of this. If you turned on like Channel 5 News in like 1986, there'd be some guy or some lady like or even if he was an asshole like Peter Arnett, like reporting from like Nicaragua where the Contras were, like people like were glued to the TV. They're like, that's what's really happening, and it's like, speaking of Arnett, they were like, I might think Arnett's an asshole, but hey, like he's a newsman, like I basically trust him even if I don't agree with his take. I mean, now with people like CNN or Fox News as seriously as they do cartoons. I mean, it's and that's never going to change. So what I mean is there's no way back from that. So it I probably won't see it in my lifetime, but I mean, like people like 20, 30 years younger than me, they're going to see like a very different culture, man, like in positive terms. I mean, there's gonna be some fucked up things and like some dark age type stuff too. That's like beginning to emerge. But if you're you're also gonna see like a reemergence of real culture, real leadership, and also just owing to various challenges, like people aren't gonna be able to pretend anymore. You know, you're gonna need like competent men who can like engineer outcomes. You know, there's gonna be real problems this century. Um, Not of the sort, you know, the climate change types say, but there are in fact going to be resource shortages. There are in fact, you know, going to be serious demographic problems in the third world. This isn't just some like Camp of the Saints nightmare or some, you know, or some chicken little like environmentalist liberal thing. Like they're wrong about like what the causes and the features of it will be, but this isn't sustainable, and I mean they know it at some level, and you know there's nothing to be afraid of, man. Like you know life always abides, and it's in God's hands. But yeah, that's why I mean that's why I'm optimistic about things, man. Like horrible as stuff might seem. I mean that's why, like I said, my mind's a black pill free space. But and again, I didn't mean to sermonize, man. Like what else you want to cover?
No, that's perfect, man. Honestly, that's the perfect note to end on. And it is optimistic. I think that should be stressed, just because, it is blackpilling, like you said, the black pill free zone. That is essential, honestly, because that
Yeah,
should be the mindset.
yeah, yeah. Because that's the winning mindset, and plus, I also happen to believe it. You know, like that's what I like. Maybe people drop on me like, "Oh, you're just saying that because like you don't want to put people off or like you want to believe that." It's like it ain't about. I mean, I'm old enough to have seen some pretty awful stuff, man, and also some pretty like beautiful and awesome stuff. And the world's a mixed bag, man. Like I'm not if I don't I'm not gonna sit around and, like delude myself like so I can like feel good or something. Like I it's just it's easier to it's easier to look at yourself as a victim, man, and that's what black pill think is. It's like victim think, and I my whole point in my writing is that I need people to think in like master caste terms, and the master caste does not think like losers. So yeah, you and I are on the same page. It's it's just important to explicate it sometimes. But yeah, again, man, thank you. I think we had a fantastic conversation this afternoon.